Hello everybody, my name is Professor Rich. Today we're going to practice some relative clauses. Let's start off with this very simple sentence that you can see on your screen. Here's the wine, sir. So we may imagine that we're in a rather nice restaurant and the waiter says, "Here's the wine, sir." The wine. So what do we know about this from this sentence? We know there is one bottle of wine. When we say here's the wine, so it's the one known bottle. When we use the definite article this means the one known. So it's the one known bottle in the context of our conversation. And this sentence is okay and complete. Here's the wine, sir. Right? Now, we could say this. We could give some additional information. Here's the wine, which came directly from Italy, sir. Here's the wine, which came directly from Italy, sir. Notice this is additional information we are adding to the previous sentence. Previously, we said, here's the wine. And now we're saying, here's the wine, which came directly from Italy, sir. This is additional information. There's still only one bottle of wine involved in the whole conversation. Now we're adding information about that bottle of wine. Notice the commas. We'll talk more about this later. Obviously, this is a relative clause, and this is what we're talking about today. So, let's look at this situation. Here we can see in the picture, oh, there's two bottles. The waiter says, here's the wine. We can put our sir in as well. Here's the wine, sir. And the customer says, there's two bottles, right? Can you imagine that? A waiter comes and they have two bottles of wine. And they say, here's the wine. And you say, what? The wine? But there's two bottles. What do you mean? The wine. Here's the pen, and someone hands you two pens. Hey everyone, here's the pen. Right? And you think, what? What's going on? So this seems to make less sense now because there are two options. So we might say something like this. Here's the cheap wine and there's the expensive wine. Now, this is not a relative clause. This is just another way to talk about the wine. Now we have these two bottles. We want to differentiate them. We can still use the definite article, but we have to say, here's the cheap wine and there's the expensive wine. These are your two options. You see how we've done that? We've just used an adjective. And then with the adjective, we can still have this noun phrase, the cheap wine, and we can have this noun phrase, the expensive wine. And that makes these two options. Here's the cheap wine, and there's the expensive wine. Now, are you ready for this? This is where it gets complicated. Another way to say something like that is like this. Here's the wine which is from England, and there's the wine which is from Italy. This could mean the same thing as here's the cheap wine, and there's the expensive wine. But now we're saying here's the wine which is from England, and there's the wine which is from Italy. This is one type of relative clause. And the important thing here is that the relative clause is part of the noun phrase. we cannot separate the relative clause from the noun. So if we remove this, if we remove which is from England from this noun, we remove it like that, then now things don't make sense. We have the same problem from before where I'm saying here's the wine and there's the wine. And it's like, what? What do you mean the wine and the wine? There's 2 bottles of wine. How can you call it the wine and the wine? No, here's the wine which is from England. That's necessary. And the relative clause, which is from England, is part of the noun. So the whole noun phrase is the wine which is from England and the wine which is from Italy. So your noun phrase includes the relative clause. That's called a defining relative clause. Defining relative clause. So when the relative clause is part of the noun phrase, then it is a defining relative clause. Notice, no comma. Okay, we're going to look at this again now. So don't worry if you're still a bit confused. That's okay. It takes a while to understand defining and non-defining relative clauses. That's the idea which I'm really going to try and explain now. So, another situation. Here is your meal. This sentence is okay. It's complete. Here is your meal. Here is your meal, sir. Okay, it's rather an interesting meal. Not quite sure what that is. I'm going to assume it's a cake. Hopefully it's not just a swan on a plate. Oh, by the way, hello to everyone in the chat. All of the many people saying hello. Hello, 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 hello. So here is your meal. The sentence is okay and complete. Great. And here's another thing we could say. This is your meal, which has been carefully prepared by our chef. Again, we're giving additional information here. This information is not necessary. We only have one meal. There is only one meal. This is your meal. That's a full sentence. And then we can add information and say, which has been carefully prepared by our chef. Notice the comma. Additional information. This is called a non-defining relative clause. The relative clause is not part of the noun phrase. Here is the noun phrase. Your meal. That's the noun phrase. And the sentence is complete without the relative clause. So you can see there, full noun, noun phrase, your meal, sentence complete. But we can add additional information using a non-defining relative clause. Notice the comma. So this is your meal, which has been carefully prepared by our chef. Another way to say this is your meal, full stop, capital letter I, it has been carefully prepared by our chef. So, additional information, non-defining relative clause. Now, what about this situation? Oh, this is like the situation before with the 2 bottles of wine. This is your meal. Wait, there's 2 meals. This is your meal, and the waiter gives you 2 meals. This is your meal. What? Which one? What do you mean? Which one of these is my meal? You said this is your meal, and you've given me 2 meals. How can we fix this? Well, again, we can use defining relative clauses. You have 2 meals, sir. This is your meal which has been carefully prepared by our chef. and that is your meal which hasn't. Do you see how the relative clause is part of the noun phrase? This is your meal which has been carefully prepared by our chef. That is your meal which hasn't. So the relative clause, defining relative clause, becomes part of the noun phrase. When we use a defining relative clause, there's no comma. It's part of the noun phrase and it gives necessary information. Without the information, the sentence does not make sense. This is your meal and that is your meal. What? What do you mean? What do you mean this is my meal and that is your meal? That doesn't make sense. How can that be my meal and this is my meal at the same time? Well, the point is we need to add information. Otherwise, we're saying that is your pen and this is your pen. This and that cannot both be my pen. But this is your meal which has been carefully prepared by our chef. And that is your meal which hasn't. You have two meals. I see. Okay. Now it makes sense. That's why here we need to use defining relative clauses, which are part of the noun phrase, don't have a comma. All right, so there's your defining relative clauses. Zoya's asking who has prepared the second meal. The children. This is your meal which has been prepared by our chef, and that is your meal that's been prepared by the children. Okay. So let me ask you a question to see if you folks in chat understand this. If you're watching this video later on YouTube, then make sure that you do, of course, smash that like button and hit subscribe and have a think about this. This will test if you understand. So here is the teacher who I told you about yesterday. Here is the teacher who I told you about yesterday. In which situation is there only one teacher? And when I say only one teacher, I mean in the context that's being presented. So in the presented context for these sentences, in which situation is there only one teacher? Here is the teacher who I told you about yesterday. Or here is the teacher who I told you about yesterday. In which situation is the teacher presented as the one and only teacher? That's the question. Is it one or two? You've got 20 seconds. So if you need to, you can pause the video. Don't worry if you get this wrong. It takes a while to really understand this. You can watch this video several times if you need to. So remember, how do you do it? You know, in this situation, in number one, we can remove the non-defining information. So what happens if we do that? We get this sentence. Here is the teacher. What does that tell you? If I say, here is the teacher, what does that tell you? Is there more than one teacher at this school? No. Or in this context. In this context, there is only one teacher. So the answer is sentence one. Well done, Vitelli. The answer is, in sentence one, there is only one teacher. In sentence two, we specify the teacher who I told you about yesterday. However, the implication is there are other teachers who I didn't tell you about yesterday. So the implication with number 2 is, in whatever context I'm talking, there are other teachers, but I didn't tell you about those teachers yesterday. So the implication in 2 is that in that context, there are more teachers. But in number 1, there is only one. Here is the teacher, is the complete sentence. And then I add, who I told you about yesterday. Okay? So in number 1, there is only one teacher. You can see another explanation about that there. Here is the teacher. The noun phrase is the teacher, which means the one and only teacher. There is only one teacher, as I've used the definite article to indicate the one and only one. And in number 2, here is the teacher who I told you about yesterday. The noun phrase is the teacher who I told you about yesterday, which means the specific teacher who I told you about yesterday. Which means there are more teachers, and perhaps ones that I didn't tell you about yesterday. It's not defining and non-defining at the same time, Pachu, because they are 2 different sentences. So sentence 1 is non-defining relative clause, and sentence 2 is a defining relative clause. These 2 sentences are different. And the point of this is to show you that just this single comma can change the meaning completely. So by using a defining or non-defining relative clause, it can completely change the meaning in forming these 2 different sentences. So let's have a look. Common uses of defining relative clauses. This is the restaurant that I told you about. This is the place that we want. You'll notice these can look a bit like cleft sentences. In fact, they are cleft sentences. Like, I told you about this restaurant. This is the restaurant I told you about. We want this place. This is the place that we want. Oh, why do we care, by the way? Why does anybody care what is a non-defining and defining relative clause? So this is what I emphasized before. A single comma totally changes the meaning. This is the teacher who has many qualifications, and this is the teacher who has many qualifications. In the first one, there is only one teacher, and that teacher has many qualifications. In the second one, the implication is there are other teachers who do not have many qualifications, but now I'm indicating the specific one who does. So the first one, there is only one teacher. The second one, I am indicating one specific teacher as indicated by this noun phrase, whereas there are in fact other teachers. And we never use that in a non-defining clause. Now, this is not strictly true because when speaking, someone might use that. However, according to correct grammar, especially when writing, we should not use that in a non-defining relative clause. So in a defining one, this is the teacher that I told you about. That is fine. It's a defining relative clause. And actually, we very often use that in defining relative clauses. But in the next one, this is my car, comma, that I've had for 5 years. That's not good. We don't like to do this, to have the comma and then that. So in non-defining clauses, we should instead use which or something else, like which, who, where, those kind of things. By the way, you can use which and where and who in defining relative clauses as well, It's just that, especially when we're speaking, we very, very often use that. Very, very often in a defining relative clause. So it's worth knowing that. You may know that with relative clauses, we can sometimes drop the pronoun, the relative pronoun. So basically, if the relative pronoun operates as the subject, we cannot drop it. This is because in English, every verb needs an explicit subject almost all the time. That's one of the strongest grammar rules in English, that the subject, the verb, needs a subject explicitly. So here's the guy that likes cheese. The verb likes. What is the subject of likes? The subject of likes is that, the relative pronoun. We cannot drop the relative pronoun. It is the subject of the verb likes. So it is required. If there is a subject already, we can drop the relative pronoun. So look here. He is the guy that I told you about. So the verb told. What's the subject of told? The subject is I. So we already have I as the subject. Therefore, we can drop the relative pronoun. Now, Patchu's asked an interesting question about the first one. Is saying, is it that or is it the guy as the subject? Well, that is the relative pronoun which refers to the guy. So the actual grammatical subject is that. But that is a relative pronoun and it means the guy. But the guy is not the subject. In terms of meaning, we could say that the guy is the same real thing as that. And so in terms of meaning, yes, we mean the guy likes cheese. But looking at the form, in terms of the grammar, the actual form subject is the relative pronoun that, which refers to the guy. All right? So I'm going to give you some practice as I did the other day. I'll give you some sentences and I'd like you to make some relative clauses with the sentences. So you're going to take the information and in each case, 1, 2, 3, you try to make a sentence with a relative clause. Doesn't matter what kind of clause you make. There are many different options here, and I'll tell you if it's okay or not. So just try to make any kind of relative clause you want correctly using the information you have. Okay? We're starting with the topic of education, following the standard IELTS topics for exams, education, health, work, and so on. So, education. Number 1, I went to 2 universities. This one is in France. Can someone make a sentence with a relative clause using that information? I'll read out the other options. While you work on that. Number 2, I went to 1 university. It was in France. Number 3, this guy was my teacher. He taught me at university. Number 4, I have only studied 1 master's. Here is the certificate. It was very difficult. So in each case, I'd like you to try and make a sentence with a relative clause. You can do it any way you want. And while you're working on it, I will give you an example for number 1. So one option for number 1. This is the university I went to, which is in France. And this, of course, is a defining relative clause. the university I went to, which is in France. Let's see what we've got. Vitelli seems to have added information there. This is the French university that I went to, but I ended up dropping out. What's that, but I ended up dropping out? It's just totally new information. Now, Sleepwalker, sorry to pick on you, but we do have some problems here. You've said this is the university, which implies the one and only one university. Now, in some context, that might work, but out of context, it sounds a little strange. Because it's like you're saying there is only one university in the world. So we need before that to have a sentence like, I went to one university. This is the university. And then extra optional information, which is in France. For number 3, Julia is trying, this guy was my teacher who taught me at university. That's great. That's good. I went to a university, which was in France. That's good for number 2, Zoya. For number 2, that makes sense. How about number 4? I have only studied one master's. Here is the certificate. It was very difficult. A little bit tricky. What can we do for this? Here is the certificate for my master's, comma, which was very difficult. There we go. So non-defining, adding information. I have only one master's. This is a certificate for my master's. So that's complete, my master's, because I just have one, comma, additional information, which was very difficult. This is important. If we drop the comma and we say, here is a certificate for my master's, which was very difficult, as one noun phrase, that means I have more than one master's. So that's the important thing there. Let's try another topic. We're moving on to the environment. So number 1 for the environment. Cars release carbon emissions. Some scientists say this is bad for the environment. Cars release carbon emissions. Some scientists say this is bad for the environment. That's a lovely sentence that you've written about universities, Vitelli. But I have to say, the information that we have indicates that only one of the universities was in France. Whereas you have said, these are the 2 French universities that I went to. So it does not match the information. However, contemporaneously is a wonderful little adverb. That's correct, Zoya. Well done. Cars release carbon emissions, comma, which some scientists say is bad for the environment. Well done. So we need the comma there. It's extra information. Okay, what about situation 2? This is one of my cars. This one is electric. This is one of my cars, full stop. This one is electric. Can you make a relative clause for that? A sentence with a relative clause. Perfect. Well done, Sleepwalker. This is my car, which is electric. That's it. No comma. The noun phrase is my car, which is electric, because I have several cars. This is one of them. And so the noun phrase needs to be my car, which is electric. Not only my car, but my car, which is electric. This is a defining relative clause. Good job. Umut here has said, here is one of my cars that is electric. The problem with your sentence, Umut, is it implies that you have several electric cars. Or it doesn't necessarily imply that, but there's a possibility of it. So we really, rather than saying my cars, we want to say this is my car, which is electric. This is my car, which is electric. We don't need to say anything about cars, because when I say this is my car, which is electric, there is already an implication that I also have other cars. Okay, let's look at the next one. Number 3 says, this is the forest near me. I like to go for walks there. So here we can use non-defining. Sleepwalker has used defining, which it's a good sentence, Sleepwalker. However, there's a slight problem with the information. Because you say, this is the forest that I like to go to, I'd like to go for walks. In your situation, in your context, you are presenting the idea that this is one forest and there are other forests, right? But I've tried to present the idea in my information that there is only one forest near me. This is the forest near me. So in this situation, it makes more sense to use a non-defining relative clause. This is the forest near me, the one and only forest near me, comma, which I like to go to for walks. Extra information. And Julia's done the same thing. Your sentences are good, but they imply a different situation, because when you use that defining relative clause, this is the forest near me where I like to go for walks, you are implying that there are more forests near you. So you are giving the situation that this is the forest where I like to go for walks, and there are other forests near me where I don't like to go for walks. That's your implication when you use the defining relative clause like that. So actually, for number 3, I would recommend using a non-defining relative clause. Like that. Okay, number 4. There are foxes living in the cities and countryside now. These ones live in the cities. So in this situation, we have multiple types of fox, and we want to talk about the specific types of foxes who live in the cities. So how do you do that? Is it defining or non-defining? After my explanation on number 3, Pachu, you've made the same mistake. That's it, Sonia. Well done. Zoya, that's one way of doing it. but it's not quite in the spirit of the exercise. So the idea for number 4 is you should use a defining relative clause. The defining relative clause will specify one type of fox and imply that there are others. So these are the foxes which live in the cities. That's all we need to say. These are the foxes which live in the cities. Sonia's missed the definite article. It's okay. Still works. So these are the foxes which live in the cities. No comma. And because we've used a defining relative clause and we have the noun phrase, the foxes which live in the cities, this implies that there are also foxes who don't live in the cities. All right. Notice I'm using which and who here. Don't worry too much about that. You can use who for animals. You can use which. No problem. Same for people, by the way. Like, he's the guy that I told you about. He's the guy who I told you about. No problem. Now we'll talk about employment. That's a fancy word for jobs and careers. So here's some information again. Situation 1. That is one of the office buildings in town. I worked there for many years. So there are several office buildings in town. I'm indicating one, and I worked there for 10 years. So can we use a single sentence with a relative clause to best represent this information? Well done, Sleepwalker. That's it. This is the office building that I worked in for 10 years. That's the answer. That's the answer. And I'm sorry to say, Julia and Zoya, because you've said this is one of the office buildings in town where I worked for 10 years, this in your situation, it implies that there are multiple office buildings where you worked. So in your situation, you have slightly different information because you're saying that there are, this is one of several office buildings in town where I worked for 10 years. Meaning that there is more than one office building where you worked for 10 years in town in your situation. So the correct answer is actually Sleepwalkers. This is the office building that I worked in for 10 years. In this situation, there is one office building that I worked in for 10 years, but there are more office buildings in town, which I didn't work in for 10 years. Okay, situation 2. These are the Microsoft offices. I used to work there. There's quite a few people using a defining relative clause here. We do not want to use a defining relative clause here. We're talking about the Microsoft offices. There are not multiple Microsoft offices in this situation. We are only talking, in this situation, in a context where there are only one Microsoft officers. Of course, with officers, we mean an office block or a building with officers. So we want to use a non-defining relative clause. These are the Microsoft officers. Extra information. These are the Microsoft officers. How should we say this? Yes, we can do that. It's really important in this situation that we have the comma and we use a non-defining relative clause, because if we don't have the comma, then it means that there are many Microsoft officers. But in this context, we want to say that there are only one, as indicated in the original sentence. Pachu, you can use that, you can say that, but you need to add a preposition at the end. So these are the Microsoft officers, comma, which I used to work, and then at the end you put in or at, and that works. We don't need to do that with the relative pronoun of were, because were already has the preposition built in. Were is like a special kind of pronoun where the preposition's built in. But when we say which, we need to use the pronoun in there as well to say work at or work in. So which I used to work at, or which I used to work in, or in which I used to work. Number 3, I will introduce you to my boss. By the way, I don't like him. So this should be quite simple. We use a non-defining relative clause. So Julia, you've missed the comma, because in your situation, because you've used a defining relative clause, then you are implying that you have more than one boss. But in the situation here, it is presented that you only have one boss. So we want to say, I'll introduce you to my boss, comma, who I don't like. That's good, Umut. However, we do not need to say, by the way, because when we use a non-defining relative clause, the by the way is implicit. Every kind of non-defining relative clause has by the way, right? So whenever we use a non-defining relative clause, it's like saying, by the way. These are the Microsoft officers. By the way, I used to work there. That's what this sentence is here. These are the Microsoft officers, comma, where I used to work. So by the way is always part of non-defining relative clause. That's actually what non-defining relative clause does. It adds by the way information. I think his job is events manager. I'd like to have that job. That's right, Sonia. Well done. The important choice here is that you use a non-defining relative clause. Again, this is by the way information, isn't it? I think his job is an events manager. By the way, I'd like to have that job. So we're adding by the way information. So we use a non-defining relative clause like Sonia has done. Well done. Okay, folks. So now that your mind is totally blown with relative clauses, we have reached question time. If you have any questions about today's class or about learning English, you can type those into the chat right now and I will do my best to answer them. I'm going to make the notes for today's class available. You will be able to find a link to those down below the video. And I will also post that link in the chat in just a moment. And there they are. All right, so any questions about learning English, you can type those questions in the chat and I'll do my best to answer them right now. Of course, thank you, Julia, for the reminder. Please do remember to hit the like button and particularly hit subscribe, especially if you're visiting the channel for the first time. The notes are now available in the chat. So everybody, how can I help you with your English or English learning? Let me know and I'll do my best. I've still got at least 10 minutes of coffee left to drink. So I have a bit of time to sit here and help you with those questions. I would like to add that relative clauses do take a bit of thinking to understand. So feel free to watch the video again, especially watching my explanation at the start of the video until you begin to understand it. It does take a little bit to understand. For me personally, a key part of understanding it is understanding the idea of the noun phrase and why it's so important whether the relative clause forms part of the noun phrase or not. Remember that a noun phrase is just two or more words which act as a noun and refer to one thing or refer to a thing or group of things. And when we have the defining relative clause, then that forms part of the noun phrase. That's really critical to understanding it. So we have a question from Sleepwalker who says, my question's about hardly ever. Oh, lovely. That's a good question already. So, hardly ever. Is it natural to ask a question like, did you hardly ever dance before? Have you hardly ever danced before? No, it's not. Not at all, really. So, in questions, we quite frequently use ever, but you wouldn't really ask a question with hardly ever. Hardly ever is really for a statement to say almost never. So, in questions, you use ever. Like, did you ever dance before? And by the way, this is quite US English because in UK English, we prefer to say, have you ever danced before? UK. So that's the natural question. And then statements, we can use hardly ever. Like, I hardly ever dance, which is fine. And that means I almost never dance. So hardly ever is just a way of saying almost never. Another way of doing this, you can answer with a short question. So, have you ever danced? We could ask the question, and we could actually answer hardly ever. Even hardly. So I hope that helps. Vitelli asked the question, it's only a matter of time before something happens, or it's only a matter of time until something happens. What's a more natural pattern? It's only a matter of time before we win. It's only a matter of time until we win. They are both very good. Personally, I think before sounds a bit more natural, but they're both possible and they're both good, Vitelli. Pachu says, these days, many AIs are evolving. Do you want to say something, especially voice mode? I said a lot about AIs quite early on, and I'm still an avid user, an enthusiast at AI. I think that the more you use it, the more you understand how to use it. I don't really have much more to say about it, Pachu. It's just a tool that you can use, and you should be aware of the issues with it. Like any tool, it can cause problems. You know, when Wikipedia first appeared on the internet, everyone was very excited about it, and over time, people began to understand that just because Wikipedia says something, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. So I don't really have anything else to say about that right now. So Manuel wants to know about the specifics, the relative pronouns to use, who, whom, and whose. So who refers to a person or personified thing or creature. Whom refers to a person, but we don't know the specific person. So it's like the person whom committed the crime shall be arrested. However, we don't know who that is. We don't know whom that is. It's a tricky one. I'm going to say we don't know who that is yet. The problem with whom, though, is that in general, whom is outdated even in correct use. So even when using whom correctly as meaning a person, but I don't know who exactly that person is, it's outdated even then. So only real grammarians will insist on using whom. Now, as for whose, whose is to indicate belonging. Like, he's the guy whose dogs make a lot of noise. So when we say whose, we're saying that the dogs belong to him. So that's when we use whose. He's the guy whose dogs make a lot of noise. Why are relative clauses sometimes called adjective clauses? Well, first of all, Minas, hello there. I've not noticed you before. Thank you so much for the question. That's quite an interesting one. Adjective clauses. Are they sometimes called adjective clauses? So, an adjective clause strictly is a superset of relative clauses. So relative clauses are a type of adjective clause. An adjective clause is a clause which acts as an adjective. And relative clauses, defining relative clauses, serve this function. You can actually see this quite well on the example from the start of the class, where in one case, I actually use an adjective, the cheap wine, to refer to this noun, And later I say the wine which is from England. So this which is from England is an adjective clause and a relative clause because it's acting as an adjective. This is the same as saying the English wine, where English is an adjective. So that's why you could refer to some relative clauses, defining relative clauses, basically, as adjective clauses, because they can act, they are clauses which can act as an adjective. The English wine. English is an adjective. We can replace that adjective with which is from England. So the wine which is from England. So I hope that answers your question, Minas. Thank you very much. Sleepwalker says, I insist on him wearing this suit. I insist on his wearing of this suit. I read that his sounds formal, but both him and his are correct. I insist on his wearing this suit. Yeah, the only difference is I would change the second one. This is the most natural. I insist on him wearing the suit. You could say, I insist on his wearing of this suit. That's okay. But the first one is more natural. And would we say it's more formal? Yes. The second one does sound more formal. But bear in mind, it also sounds a little bit strange. Thank you very much, Umut, for the super chat. Whatever coffee I'd like to drink. Well, you know, actually, Umut, at the moment, I'm drinking iced coffee. And I don't normally drink iced coffee, actually. But there's a few reasons why I've started drinking it. Firstly, because it started to bother me when my coffee goes cold. And I started to get quite obsessed with keeping my coffee hot, to the extent that I'm microwaving coffee, and then you get the skin, like the milk skin on top of the coffee, and it all goes wrong, and that's horrible. So now I'm trying to get used to drinking iced coffee, because then I don't need to worry about it going cold anymore. So that is my coffee of choice at the moment. Thank you so much for the super chat. Sleepwalker says, hardly ever does she visit her relatives. I saw that we can use hardly ever to make inversion. Can I use hardly? Hardly does she visit her relatives. Ooh. Hardly. Hardly does she visit her relatives. Hardly ever. Hardly does she visit her relatives. You could use hardly does she ever visit her relatives, and that is something which people would say. However, it is a little bit wrong. And the way that it's wrong relates to the meaning. So when we say hardly, what we mean is almost not. So if we say, I hardly won, it means I almost didn't win. So I did win, but I almost didn't. So she hardly visits her relatives is like she almost doesn't visit her relatives. Now, although we can understand from that you mean she almost never or she hardly ever visits her relatives, we will assume that's what you mean. You might also mean something a bit different, and more directly, the meaning would be that she almost fails to visit her relatives. So like visiting her relatives is something she attempts and she almost fails that. Do you see what I mean? So if we don't have ever it's like you take out the aspect of frequency and it becomes more about success. Does she succeed in visiting her relatives? And you're saying like, oh, she almost fails, but she does it, you know? However, you will hear people say stuff like that. Maybe it would be a little bit clearer or a little bit more correct to use hardly it with inversion, something like this. Like, hardly did I manage to get a distinction. Or hardly can I keep on top of the rising cost of living. Okay, something like that. Now, of course, because these are sentences with inversion, they are quite formal and unusual. So do not overuse sentences with inversion, but they are correct. And thank you very much, Manuel, for your coffee. I wish I could link Stripe to YouTube so I can pop that up like I can with Umut. Like, I love this little super chat logo. It's great. All right, folks, do we have any other questions? Anyone waiting in chat? Feel free to ask a question. Before we go on our different ways to enjoy the rest of the weekend. If you are interested in classes, by the way, you can contact me, professorrich@gmail.com. Professor spelt with one S. Why? Because it's Spanish for teacher. And when I started teaching English, I lived in Spain. And so I chose the name Professor Rich. And now forever, I am condemned to explain why there is only one S in my name. I think I answered that one, Julia. So this is Vitelli's question, which was, it's only a matter of time before something happens or only a matter of time until something happens. So both are correct, but before sounds a little bit better to me, but they're both absolutely fine. It's only a matter of time until we win. It's only a matter of time before we win. Yeah, they're both correct. Neither of them sound unnatural, to make that clear. What are you all doing with your weekend? Do you have plans? I hope you've all got interesting things to do this weekend. I think we're wrapping up. Just going to give you another minute if anyone has any questions. And then we're gone. Manuel's testing out his adversions. Hardly ever have I visited when we jumped into this morning in the supermarket. Let me fix that for you, Manuel. Hardly ever have I visited her when I bumped into her this morning in the supermarket. Hardly ever had I visited her when I bumped into her this morning in the supermarket. How to retell the lecture. What do you mean by that, Pachu? Can you clarify what you mean? Because I'm not quite sure what you mean. Thank you very much, Sleepwalker. You too. I hope you have a lovely weekend, lovely rest of your week. Manuel says this weekend will be for sleeping in. After a preposition, use the ing form of the verb, Manuel. This weekend will be for sleeping in, so as to recover from the sleep deprivation this holiday. Fantastic. Do you have any tips on how to sleep well, Manuel? I'm really struggling at the moment. My sleep is awful. Lecture on any topics. No, I'm still lost, Pachu. How to retell lectures on any topics. What do you mean? Do you mean how to rewatch the videos on YouTube? Like, you can find them on the channel. There's a little tab on the channel, live. You go there and all of the classes we've done, which is now hundreds of classes, they're all there. And there's a playlist. Every single class goes into a playlist as well. It's all there. Right, that's it. Thank you very much, everybody. Do have a lovely weekend, a lovely rest of your week. And I'll be back next weekend. We seem to be on a bit of a grammar thing at the moment, so I might do a little bit more grammar. Please do share the channel and this video with anyone you think will be interested. And I will, as always, catch you next time. Have a lovely weekend, everybody. Bye-bye.